everybody. This is Joanna Schaffner-Scott, and you are listening to the Race in the Workplace podcast, a show for DEI organizational leaders that explores race, racism, and racial equity in the workplace. I am a racial equity consultant and founder of the Stamey Street Consulting Group, a consulting firm that specializes in partnering with organizations to help them meet their racial equity aspirations. My goal for you is to move your organization from being colorblind to equity-centered through sustainable, step-by-step changes. This week's episode will explore organizational readiness. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. I will explore what it means to be ready to make a racial equity commitment. It's my experience that each new stage or each new place on an organization's racial equity journey requires a new level of readiness. So there's readiness to start, and then there's readiness and progression from one stage to another. So if you are leading racial equity work and you're finding yourself constantly frustrated, it could be that your organization has hit a readiness gap. And by that, I mean it's progressed to a new growth stage that it isn't quite ready for yet. Okay, let's get into it. Hi, it's Joanna Schaffner-Scott here. I am so excited to be with you today. Thank you for allowing me to join you in your day, no matter when you're listening. This week's episode will explore organizational readiness. So I want to unpack what it means to be ready to make a racial equity commitment, and then what it means to move between stages on an organizational journey. Because I believe that each new place of growth requires its own readiness. So DEI professionals, if you are leading racial equity work in an organization and you're finding yourself constantly frustrated, it could be that your organization has hit a readiness gap. And by that, I mean it's progressed to a new growth stage that it isn't quite ready for. And that in of itself can be a real challenge. So I want to unpack that a little bit today and give you some strategies to both recognize where you are, but also help move your organization forward in its journey. Okay. So I think conversations about journey have to start with what a journey looks like. And so this is kind of tough. Even though I've been in the work for a long time, it's kind of tough because for most organizations, this is not a linear journey. So it's not like a straight line by any means. There are bends and curves in the road in terms of the journey, and there are also stops and starts. So it's not linear at all. And many times you have to circle back and revisit, prior agreements, prior commitments. So there's a moving forward and a circling back and a moving forward. So it's not linear. So I want to be really clear about that. So when we think about journeys and stages, I want to at least offer a framework. And so I wrote a blog about this. I wrote a piece about this on my blog that's called How to Identify Your Organization's Racial Equity Stage. So I'll link to it in the show notes. But generally, I want to give you some guidance. So I think that there are certain stages, but as I said, it's not linear. So just kind of bear with me as I unpack it a little bit more. So most organizations, what I call the beginning, that's the start of the work. So maybe there's a project that's been funded by a grant. Maybe your organization has created some shared learning space using mostly lunch and learns. Maybe if you're in a large organization, you've got company employee resource groups, so ERGs. Likely your organization has a few staff of color who have a pretty sharp racial analysis that they have the space to contribute to the work, but maybe it's not consistent, or maybe it's just by topic area, but not necessarily cutting across the organizations. And so within that first 6 months of making a commitment, organizations tend to do as much as they can on their own. But then they think, well, I think I need a little bit more help. And so they move to what I call the digging in stage, which is an intermediate place that organizations find themselves at the 6-month plus mark. And that may mean bringing in a consultant, someone like myself. It may mean bumping up against some initial resistance. So this may be some of the first resistance that organizations encounter. Maybe there's some work happening on shared language. Maybe there's a few more staff of color that have been brought in. If the organization is not racially diverse to start with, And then there may be some changes in external products, maybe reports, papers, website, photos. People are taking a closer look at those things. So it's kind of an intermediate. We're just trying to figure out, we've gone as far as we can. We're trying to figure out where we need to go. And maybe we've hired some help to get there. So that's what I call digging in. And then there's another place that's kind of an intermediate place. And I think sometimes organizations don't move out of this space. But it's your organization may have a framework for thinking about race and racism. Maybe there's an internal language. Maybe some of your communications has shifted. Maybe there's a clearly expressed commitment. And maybe there is, as much work that has happened externally. Maybe there's been a little bit of work around partnerships. But it's really a bend in the road because it's at that time in the intermediate digging in step, at least this is how I describe it. Some organizations never move past this point because the internal systems work is too hard. They may not know how to shift. They may not know what to do. So they get stuck and they stay stuck. Okay. So there's not necessarily a time element there, but it's more around activities, like what are the activities that have kind of been exhausted, but there's absolutely a stickiness when it comes to looking at the internal systems, which really are some of the places where you've got to really confront power and privilege in order to move the organization forward. Okay, I've got one more stage, and then I want to bring it back to readiness. So there's a place that I call advanced, and the advanced place is not necessarily about time. It's much more about actions. So this includes the items in the digging in kind of step. It concludes like looking at, maybe there's a shared language, maybe there's it includes that kind of stuff, but also it's deeper work in essence. So it's organizations have, reviewed their policies and practices. Maybe they've made some adjustments. Maybe they're working towards some adjustments. Organizational leaders are doing their own work. You're no longer, as an organization, depending on hiring to create equity. Rather, you're really looking at your internal policies, practices, protocols, making changes and living into the commitment. And you're constantly looking for ways to be more strategic about partnerships. You're really intentional about questioning your vendor practices. So there's a lot of, it's just deeper work at that level. And in my practice, I see very few organizations in that space. There are some for sure, but I think that even when organizations think they're advanced, that's not often reflected in the everyday experiences of their staff. And it's also not reflected in the everyday experiences of their partners, meaning that's probably not what their partners would say about them. So it's helpful as we think about readiness to think about these stages and to think about where your organization is along this path, because I think it matters how you move them forward if you have a sense of where you are. Okay, so I want to lift up 3 strategies to help you move your organization from one stage to another. So the very first strategy is going to be to create a very clear equity why with a supporting framework. So the equity why is critically important to this work. No matter what you're doing, why you're doing it is really important. So you need to adopt an organizational framework that explains how your organization sees the world and its work in the world. Your framework should include a historical and a place-based analysis that names structural racism and how your work disrupts it and your connection to the community. So that's really important because that work should also be anchored in your mission and vision. And it's important to name the why because it's very hard to get people jazzed about the how if they're not clear on why. So I just want to name that. So that's one way to move from one stage to another. And when I see folks spinning between stages, it's almost always because there's not a clear sense of why. Okay, so strategy number 2 to move an organization from one stage to another is you have to accept, this is a tough one, so stay with me, that the pathway forward is going to be paved using adaptive strategies. Okay, there is an entire body of literature on adaptive leadership. I use adaptive leadership in my practice all the time. And adopting racial equity as a practice requires change. And that change is unearthed through understanding that the challenges that you're confronting are adaptive, meaning that it requires a new learning, new innovation, and new behavior. And I'm going to link to some of my favorite resources for adaptive leadership in the show notes. But that's in essence what adaptive leadership is. Okay. And so what that means is that there are solutions that are more technical, like tools, toolkits, training, things like that. Those are really helpful and can help advance the work, but they're not sufficient enough to solve adaptive challenges. Okay. And the short-term fix for what's an adaptive question can feel like performative box checking, right? So it's like, okay, we need to take a look at our partnerships and are we partnering in ways that align with our values? That's an adaptive question. That's an adaptive challenge. So from that requires that people like come together, talk it through, and decide on a new strategy. It's harder to adopt a strategy with that particular example. That's like a checklist, for example. Then that's technical and feels literally like checking the box. So technical solutions don't move you forward. So it's tough because lots of times organizations want an easy answer. They want, well, Joanna, tell us what to do. And sometimes I can. Other times it's really going through the process of talking it out, of getting feedback, of listening, and then changing behavior. And that's harder, but it's adaptive. Okay. That's the second strategy. While we have this little break, I want to invite you to check out my blog, also called Race in the Workplace, at raceatwork.com. There you will find so much goodness. I always share practical how-tos and racial equity best practices, all written for DEI leaders inside organizations. Check it out. The third strategy is around accountability. And so when we're thinking about strategies for moving an organization from one stage to another, accountability is critical. Accountability starts with yourself. And I just finished a series at the time this pod is being recorded. I just finished a 2-part series on accountability that I'll link to in the show notes about organizational accountability. But in this moment, I'm talking about accountability starting with self. And what I mean by that is for managers, directors, anyone within an organization with decision-making power to actively examine and sit with their behavior and shift where it's needed. So it's the doing that work of creating an environment where if someone inadvertently or on purpose causes harm, hopefully it's not on purpose, but we know that happens. So we'll stick with inadvertently. So if someone inadvertently causes harm, that there's a space for that harm to be addressed in ways that maintain the dignity of both people. I'm going to leave that there, but that is the hard adaptive work that is critically important to maintain accountability for the way we treat each other. So if your organization has declared itself to be anti-racist, then you've got to do the internal work that statement requires. It is being who you say you are. The staff of color are not responsible for holding the organization accountable to its equity commitments. Once there's a clear equity why, it's everyone's job to make sure that the organization is living into that why. Okay. Here are a couple of check-in questions around accountability. Does your organization have the capacity to handle equity issues like micro and macro aggressions, like creating advancement pathways for promotion, like resolving wage disparities? These are tough issues. All need a systemic fix. A second check-in question on accountability. Does your organization follow the policies, practices, and processes outlined in your organization's policy manual? I don't mean do you have one, I mean do you follow it? Because those are two very different things. And then when was the last time it was updated? Our world is changing, and so our policies need to adjust, and our policies need to also reflect our values as they are today. So those are some strategies that you can use to move an organization from one stage to another. Having a clear why with a supporting framework, accepting and adopting that pathway is going to be paved using adaptive strategies, and accountability is critical. So maintaining an accountability that is followed through with policies, practices, and protocols. So those are strategies. Okay. So what I want to do at this point is I want to talk about, now that you recognize that you are in between stages, how do you get ready to move to the next stage? So I want to lift up 3 action steps that will help you move to the next step, that will help increase your readiness. Okay. All right. So action step number 1 is allotting the necessary time to do the adaptive work. This is so important because building an organization that centers racial equity as a practice takes time. It just does. There's no shortcut around that. You're in a new place in your journey now. It's going to take some time to figure out what that means, and it's going to take some time to figure out what it means for everyday work. There's no way around that. Racial equity as a practice will always gets pushed to the side due to time constraints. So you've got to figure out how to give people the sufficient time to do deeper work and adaptive work around what it means to move to the next stage and what it means to exist within the current stage. Okay. I think about this in the context of partners work. I don't do community work. I have a colleague who does that. But what I know about that work is that staff need time to build those relationships, to learn and to practice applying a racial equity perspective to their work. And I do know that from a policy perspective and thinking about my own journey as a policy analyst. And when I first started doing racial equity work, it was in that context. And I needed time to think about, okay, who are the partnerships? We're not partnered in the right way. What are the partnerships I need? Time for reading, reflection, time to practice. Those are all really important things, particularly when we're asking people to learn something new or to prepare to learn something new. Organizations many times work at a really fast pace as the norm. So that means we must hardwire these practices into the everyday, because moving too fast takes away the opportunity for reflection and collaboration. Both are critical for moving to the next place in the journey. All right. Action step number 2, take a look at your prior commitments. So anything that's been agreed to in the past, like your value statement, I don't necessarily think your mission or vision statement have to be revised all the time, but certainly values should be revisited, because chances are whenever your organizational or company values were created, probably the people who work there now didn't create them. So it's helpful to go back to that to be sure and ask yourselves as an organization, is this still who we are? And it might be yes, awesome, but it's important to have that conversation. Or it could also be that your organization has advanced in its journey. And so those agreements and those value documents need to be reviewed, revisited, and revised. So go back to review prior commitments. And the last action step to help an organization move between stages is to pivot without penalty. And I feel so strongly about this. As I mentioned earlier, moving along from one place to another in an organization's equity journey requires that organizations be adaptive. So I've shared a little bit about that, and I'll share resources in the show notes. Tools alone cannot advance your journey. They can't, and I've talked about this earlier. Tools are important, they're necessary, but they can't advance you to the next bend in the road. So I suggest that folks be able to pivot without penalty. And this is a concept that I borrowed from Adam Grant's work, Think Again. That's a great book, by the way. I'll link to it in the show notes. But it's the idea that when someone raises a new idea or a new suggestion for doing something differently, that there's an unspoken penalty for raising an issue or a new idea. For example, a person may say, hey, we should reach out to this group or that group to start a new partnership. And then they are penalized for raising the idea. So it might be, okay, that's going to extend our time frame for this project by 2 weeks because we have to make sure that we've got a new partnership. Or what if we get the new partnership? What if we move the partnership forward and the partner actually has feedback. They actually are giving us the feedback we asked for, which means we have to change the way we're doing the work. And then faulting the person who made the suggestion. Those are penalties. They're unspoken, but definitely felt. And so what's likely to happen the next time the person has an idea? Are they likely to raise it? Or are they less likely to raise it? I think probably less likely in some cases. But what's important about that in moving between stages on one's equity journey is that it's important to create a culture where people can ask questions, put new thoughts, ideas on the table, and that those are welcomed as an important part of organizational growth. All right. Are y'all still with me? Okay. As I wrap up this episode, I want to share a reflection with you. So I said this earlier, but I want to reemphasize that equity journeys are rarely linear. There are bends in the road, there are stops and starts. And sometimes we just have to stop and circle back, and we have to give ourselves time to do that. And so I want to encourage you in that we as practitioners are constantly growing, we're constantly learning. And when that happens, that also means we're constantly looking at the way we're working. And sometimes we circle back to do something different, or we're making different choices as our own knowledge in the work grows. And that has to be okay too. So my parting advice to you, or my parting guidance, I should say, is if you're leading DEI work inside an organization and you're finding yourself in this place of struggle, it could be that your organization has moved to a different place in its journey, and that different place requires different strategies to move you forward. So I hope that you can use the action steps that I've outlined here in the episode, this week's episode, and the strategies that I've shared for moving between stages. I hope you can use all of that as guidance in your work to move your organization, your nonprofit, or your government agency forward in its equity journey. Goodness knows there is enough work to do, and we need all the tools we can to actually do it. All right, take the best of care. That's this week's episode of Race in the Workplace. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, and share it with a friend who may be a DEI professional who can use these strategies in their work. My hope for the podcast is that it reaches every person who needs it. Until next time, take care.